Bill, thank you so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure as always. I always enjoy your programs, and you're just really a great interviewer.
That's an honor to hear from you. So thank you very much, and you make it easy as an interviewee. I want to start by we're going to do a little tour here. We're going
Yeah.
from Zimbabwe to Sudan. There's a lot in the mix here. There's, I think, obviously first and foremost, what we attempt to do on the show, to the extent it's possible, is talk about politics and the terms of the country itself, whether it be Zimbabwe, Russia, Brazil, or wherever. Then there's also the global patterns that we're concerned with, things like austerity, inequality, and so on, the rise of fascism. So there's that dynamic. Then there's also the broader dynamic of how and when do we cover particularly Africa, when it's these sort of poverty porn stories that pathologize African governments. There's a lot of attention when it's protests that implicate not only corrupt autocratic African leaders, but also the governing economic models that still emanate from the West, a little bit less so. So that brings us, let's start with Zimbabwe. There have been protests there that have been really aggressive the past couple of weeks, and a very aggressive government crackdown. Maybe explain, just really broadly, what is being protested there? And maybe as part of that, could you refresh us? We covered this when it happened, but maybe refresh us on the transition from Robert Mugabe to Emerson Mnangagwa.
I think you have to start with the question of where did Mugabe come from, in order to answer your question. So what's important for your listeners to appreciate is that there was a liberation struggle that went on in Zimbabwe against the white minority regime of Ian Smith when the country was called Rhodesia. There were two major liberation movements: the Zimbabwe African National Union and the Zimbabwe African People's Union. There was also an independent army that was called the Zimbabwean Independent People's Army, I believe. That was a third force for several years. Ultimately, the pressure from these forces brought about a negotiated settlement that ended white minority rule. It was called the Lancaster House Accords. And that was followed by an election in which Robert Mugabe's ZANU Popular Front came out on top. Now, ZANU and Mugabe had been associated with a sort of Marxist current within the National Liberation Movement, a different one than the ZAPU, and was really emphasizing national independence and economic development. And there were very important reforms that were introduced in the beginning of the administration of Mugabe. At the same time, there was repression of opponents, both within ZANU as well as externally. A lot of that was ignored by many of us on the outside, particularly those of us that had been supportive of the Zimbabwean revolution. There was some level, Michael, of denial. Mm-hmm. And we let that happen. So that's the background. Then what happens is Mugabe stays in power, and ultimately, by the end of the 80s and early 90s, begins to institute economic policies that were largely framed by the international financial institutions. This created a lot of unrest among the population, and the Trade Union Federation, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, which had been a part of ZANU-PF, separates, becomes an independent federation, and then finds itself in struggle with the economic policies of Mugabe. Mm. So that's sort of the background. Now, Mugabe ultimately is ousted for a variety of reasons, including that he basically antagonized pretty much everybody. It wasn't just antagonizing the West. He was antagonizing his own people and also antagonizing other elements of the Zimbabwean ruling class. And so he ends up being forced out. The new administration that comes in and is technically elected, and I say technically because there is significant controversy about the legitimacy of the election. Nevertheless, there was a willingness to give the new administration some latitude. The demonstrations that you were referring to were demonstrations that were sparked by a popular protest against fuel hikes. And then things exploded.
And so when we track this transition, and what's happening now, those two sort of themes. So first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of looking at Zimbabwe before for segments we did on it last year and in general was that not only in the 1980s were some on the left and some who were committed to liberation willing to overlook some of Mugabe's abuses, but that actually, and maybe this is a stretch, but I feel like there was almost like a certain type of Benazir Bhutto parallel for a minute, because it seemed like there was a time when he was both, because he was a liberation hero, a friend of the left, but that actually he was also embracing in the 80s a lot of sort of World Bank, IMF directions. So he's very, he's very polished. He's very urbane. So he did good BBC interviews. So he was also kind of embraced by the capitalist order as well. And so I want to get to the extent to like, what is the dual process there of Zimbabwe's economy coming apart? Because obviously the narrative here is this is, African or left or kleptocratic. And besides the racist narrative of African, I mean, kleptocratic is certainly true. But what extent was the implementation of what the World Bank and IMF wanted other part of this broader breakdown?
Well, that's a very astute observation that you're lending. That it was absolutely true that certainly in the 80s, that in the early 90s, that Mugabe was able to speak with forked tongue. He knew the language of Marxism. He knew the language of the left. He knew how to utilize it. We have many examples in our own country of leaders who were schooled within the left. They know the language, they know how to use it, but their politics have actually shifted. I'm not going to name names, but that is, it's not unusual, and that's exactly what was going on. What happens is Mugabe accepts the policies of structural adjustment, and at the same time, he had cut a deal with the white farmers to not move against them, and they were willing to support him, at least initially. There was a movement from the base that came from veterans of the Liberation War and others who were insistent that there needed to be land redistribution. Mugabe, when he was faced with a threat to his power, and the opposition, largely based in the labor movement initially, was really taking him on, all of a sudden he wrapped himself in the flag of Zimbabwean nationalism, embraced the veterans who were seeking land redistribution, and got ahead of it, claiming to be the leader of this. So he was someone that definitely spoke with forked tongue. The land redistribution needed to happen. The way that it happened, however, was very problematic, because the question was who was going to benefit from the land redistribution. And this is where it's really important to have a class analysis and understand that the battles that have gone on around national liberation have not simply been battles for national freedom, but they've been battles for national freedom influenced by the classes that are operating within those national liberation movements. And so the class that Mugabe ends up representing was one that was interested in benefiting from land redistribution, benefiting from sovereignty, but they weren't talking about a thoroughgoing democratization of Zimbabwe. So that put that class that Mugabe represented against working people. And one of the problems in the United States is that many of us sitting on this side of the pond were transfixed by Mugabe's rhetoric and did not look at the concrete situation. And it was really funny because I went to Zimbabwe for a visit some years ago while Mugabe was the president. And one of the things that was fascinating was that, you know, the leaders of the trade union federation I was speaking to, they couldn't understand. Don't people understand who Mugabe is? That's what they kept asking me. It's like, why are African Americans entranced with this guy? Don't they see what's going on? And I tried to explain what the situation was, and I don't think I did it to their satisfaction. So when Mugabe ends up ultimately getting bounced, the new administration that emerges, as I was mentioning earlier, they got a pass, at least initially. But then the economic crisis, the issue of the real need to redistribute the wealth, etc., becomes a critical matter in Zimbabwe, and people start protesting, and that's when this massive repression comes down that was that stunned many people, because it wasn't just the brutality. It was like the internet was cut off. I mean, external communication was cut. It was an absolute attempt to smash an opposition that was not trying to overthrow the government.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll pivot to Sudan in a second. So is it almost? I know. I mean, Egypt had that interlude where the Muslim Brotherhood was elected in somewhat in open elections. But to me, it's like, does it kind of reflect Egypt, where there was a lot of energy around one specific, pretty broadly loathed figure who had, I mean, if I understand correctly, he even pissed people off on the level of essentially like bypassing people like an Emerson Mnangagwa, who had his was a very important player in both the liberation and also the oppression that you mentioned,
right?
And then to basically put his new wife ahead of them, so he got everybody was done with him, and then Mnangagwa comes in, but it's not a revolution or a big change because all the structure is still in place. It's just a personality shift.
That's right. It's not altogether different from the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos from the Philippines.
Okay.
And so what you end up having is not an ultimate crack or elimination of the regime. You have an elimination of certain individuals. And I think that that's one of the things that's becoming more apparent in Zimbabwe. And if you want to pivot to the Sudan, this is a challenge facing the Sudan, because in the midst of this popular uprising against the al-Bashir regime, one of the issues that is going to quickly emerge is whether al-Bashir will be replaced, but the regime itself will remain intact. That's the approach that the United States government, for example, has tried at different points. That was one of the things that they wanted to see happen in Syria. They wanted to get rid of Assad, but not get rid of Assadism.
Right.
And so you see these things. You saw it in Yemen with the end of the Saleh regime. And with not, Ali Saleh is ousted, but you don't have the end of the regime. So those questions haunt us when it comes to both Zimbabwe and the Sudan.
You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video, and you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.